on, because we're going to go straight over to Christian, who's going to tell us a little bit about what this business model canvas is all about. Because there's some social entrepreneurs here, I'm sure, that will benefit from.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think it comes back to what we discussed earlier. That basically you have these different elements we talked about, and then kind of you try to relate it to your own organization and try to figure out exactly as Mark said, like what are the This is why it's so important to make that step back, to not directly jump into it and say, well, I have a product idea here, but rather to first say, okay, well, what is the paradigm we are talking about? Like when we talk about banking, most people are within their box. I don't want to use that. Like I hate this phrase, like outside the box, because usually only people who think inside the box say that term. But I'm using it anyways now. So the point being that usually you're thinking in your box, right? You're thinking in your box in terms of traditional paradigms. When you think about banking, you think about, okay, a banking branch or it's somehow like a small shop somewhere. But as Mark said, like there's a if you think about the core issue being how do I get money from A to B, then you think about it differently, because it doesn't have to be a branch, it doesn't have to be something physical in a way, but it can be something which goes mobile or so. So in the end, I think that the business model canvas is a tool to say, well, let me first reflect on what we're actually trying to do, and then let's lay down the steps in terms of what the different elements are and how they fit to each other. And then in the end, you want to have a good storyline which somehow makes sense for the whole.
So the business model canvas is essentially replacing a business plan, would you say?
Well, I would say it's kind of, in a way, an abbreviation of the business plan. That basically, I don't know, those of you who came, I think it was popularized by Osterwalder in St. Gallen, so he wrote his PhD, and he somehow came across this idea, well, okay, when I look at a business, somehow it seems that there are some patterns that are like the same across businesses in terms of categories that I try to understand, and some of these categories are, there has to be a value proposition, there has to be a revenue model, and so on, so on, so on. And I think what we learned from that a lot was, I think the mistake we did, for example, at the LSE a few years back was that we taught courses saying, this is how you critically think about business, this is how you critically evaluate it, and so on, so on. But we never had a real tool to say, okay, well, and this is when you now want to start, this is how you can pragmatically think about it. And I think when you're at an institution like the LSE, the issue always is there are no simple models, right? There are no simple one-size-fits-it-all. So I think we always try to not go too deep into the kind of prescribed canvas, but rather to say, okay, well, we see that there are different elements, and these are the elements we want to think about. And then how you fit them together, that is up to the respective context and the respective entrepreneur. But I think in the end, I mean, those of you who are interested in that, I think Osterwalder, I mean, I can't say that usually as an academic, but I think pragmatically speaking, if you look at Osterwalder, he has a very interesting tool set now he developed where you can interactively develop your own model. So it's very, very helpful if you really want to hands-on develop your project. And if you want to learn more, then I think you want to make one more step and say, okay, well, I don't take the prescribed business school model, but rather step back and critically reflect on it as well.
So I think now we can move on to the audience, perhaps, and questions for the panel, comments.
I'm based in a company called Bear Valley Ventures, trying to launch some social ventures in developing countries in hygiene and sanitation. And I completely subscribe to the view that the business model is critical. We actually have product innovations, but we are struggling a bit with the business model side. And what I wanted to ask the panel was, is there a way of kind of testing creative business models with limited resources, because we don't have a lot of money? So how can you, if you have an idea for a different business model, how can you kind of evaluate it in a way which doesn't actually running the business and see if it works? Do these kind of things exist? Can you do kind of sequential recycling that you do with product innovation? Other techniques like that could help to kind of arrive at the whole business model with limited resources.
I feel I talked so much.
I can have a stab at that if you want. I think there's a couple of things that you can do. I mean, so one of the big sort of heroes of the current entrepreneurship movement is Eric Ries, who wrote this wonderful book, The Lean Startup. And he's a huge advocate of continuous experimentation in terms of what you're doing. And if you read what he describes, is this very interesting model where they go out and just there's a lot of very low cost ways you can try and experiment with different kinds of approaches to marketing to a customer, for example, or distribution, and some of these can be incredibly simple. So I don't know exactly what your product is. But if you look at entrepreneurs, for instance, in certain developing countries selling products like solar lanterns or irrigation products or some of these things, we have a number of Ashoka fellows that experimented with some really innovative ways of doing that. And they might have two teams going out into a village, and one team will go door to door, another will set up a kiosk on the corner. And they scientifically look at them and at the end of the day tally which one was more effective and then pivot the model based on that. So that's certainly one approach which a lot of startup gurus think is a fantastic approach, and I would agree with that. The other, though, is basically to shamelessly rip off as many models as you can and look around you to see what works, basically, and what can be done, and find inspiration from whatever corner you can. If somebody is serving that market and doing so effectively, even if that product looks nothing like what you're doing, there's probably something you can do to learn from that. And one of the examples that I always love is one of the most successful and scaled social enterprises in the world is Aravind Eye Hospitals. A very famous case study in India, which now does over 400,000 eye surgeries a year, 2/3 of them for free. With a typical surgeon doing 20 operations a day on cataract surgery. Now, where did the founder get the idea for creating a model like that? It was from McDonald's. He went to the United States. Dr. Govindata Venkateswamy went to the United States. And if McDonald's can find a process that can serve 1 million burgers a day or whatever it is, could he take some of those concepts and apply them to eye surgery? And he did it beautifully, with the parascaling and all the models and that. So I think it's about looking wherever you can and finding people who are serving that market and doing it in a similar way.
And would another way be to partner with organisations on the ground then, if they're already delivering to this market? Any other questions?
My question is more about financing and funding. So one of the core concerns with social franchises tend to be, well, A, investors, and then the other we were talking about in our bottom of the pyramid. 3.8 billion people, yeah, that's a great number, but most of them operate in the informal economy. And how do you tap that market? And they're making less than $2 a day, or whatever it might be. How does that scale up and directly benefit and operate the business? And then you working at Ashoka, I'm sure you know, microfinance plays a huge role. I think the issue that I have is that business tends to operate and cater to the market, yeah? That's the very essence of a business model. So they'll look at culture, they'll look at different regional things, McDonald's being a great example. They'll have a rice burger, they'll have a tofu burger, and wherever, different parts of Asia. But development tends to have a universal blanket approach with the MGGs. And I guess my question to you guys is, how do you mitigate the two? What is a social franchise? What is a social enterprise? Microfinance systems in India, it's quite a controversial topic. The concept of debt among women, different age groups, different ethnicities. How do you mitigate the two of those? And is it not better to be a for-profit corporate model, but engaged in a triangulated partnership where you are accountable to the NGO or you're accountable to policy or the public sector in which you're working?
Let me try that question now.
Well, happy to jump on it. I think it's a very good and multi-layered question, I think, which comes partly back to the point that when you look at something like microfinance, so maybe for those of you who are not 100% aware of that, basically microfinance obviously was a great tool to empower people to have a certain base for investment for themselves. But also the problem being that a lot of them fell into problems that if you can't fund your loan, that you then have to take another loan, and then you get into this spiral, for example, or other issues. So there are some issues which came more and more across because, again, it was relatively single-layerly tackled. I think what's interesting now is that there is more and more solutions where they try to embed that into existing products and services and into existing business models. So when you say you develop, for example, a model where you have eyeglasses, that you basically also provide the micro-funding for these things, so that you basically relate the funding specifically to the different services and products versus having a standalone service only. But also I think the second question, which I think also comes back to what you said about what I'm most excited at the moment is exactly the whole kind of replication, and then social franchising is one kind of way to replicate and scale much faster in terms of what we, funny enough, had earlier today was a big roundtable around the question, how can we standardize in these environments services and products which somehow make sense in that context, but how can we scale that up standardizedly but still localize it as much as possible? And so one of the core approaches towards that would be social franchising, that you say, okay, well, we have a certain idea that we have a certain burger. Burger is like the McDonald's model holds partly, I guess, in terms of that, yes, there is variation. On the other hand side, in social franchising, obviously, it's a lot more about community and a lot more about embeddedness. But the point being that I think it's a very interesting approach, what we've seen with a lot of field studies, that implicitly a lot of the social enterprises that really scale implicitly use a micro-franchise model. Because that is a way, or a social franchise model, because it is a way to take a global vision and put it into the local context with local buy-in and with local investment. So the point being that if you have the skin in the game in terms of idea ownership and in terms of financial ownership, then that, again, reconciles some of these problems, because you literally have people who on the ground know what the real issues are and then contextualize that on the ground. So I feel social franchising is particularly interesting because it remedies some of the problems that usually when you have standardized solutions, they somehow always miss out one or two contextual problems, versus if you have people on the ground who actually live in the community, usually that can be better balanced. Does that more or less answer the point? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.